Hi, this is Robert Scheer with another edition of Scheer Intelligence, where the intelligence, I hasten to say, comes from my guests. And in this case, it's Dr. Stephen Bezruchka. I hope I got that right,
Yeah.
but who has written a fascinating book. He's a fascinating guy. I'm going to let him describe his own life. He's a mountain climber. He's been in Nepal teaching medicine. We've worked with Physicians for Social Responsibility, which won the Nobel Prize for their concern of nuclear war. But this new book, which is just out now as we're doing this interview, is called Inequality Kills Us All: COVID 19's Health Lessons for the World. And tell me the thesis, because basically you acknowledge we're in some ways doing more than we've done now with Medicare and everything expansion and Affordable Care Act. And yet we have terrible outcomes. And you even keep some kind of record like a health Olympics. Just basically tell us why we spend a lot of money. Why do we have such lousy outcomes?
So I worked as an emergency physician for 30 years. And the easiest diagnosis I could make in the emergency department was that somebody was dead. So it's very hard to fake being dead. And so I like to look at whether you're dead or alive as a measure of health. And all rich countries collect birth and death information. And this allows us to come up with a number called life expectancy or lifespan, average length of life for a year in question if the mortality didn't change. So back in the 1950s, although we didn't live such long lives, our health measured by life expectancy was in the top 5 or 10 in the world. That is, we were one of the healthiest countries in the world. And the same is true for other mortality measures of health. But then other countries began seeing more rapid improvements in length of life than we did. So by the time I went to medical school in 1970 at Stanford, we ranked 17th among countries. Remember, we were in the top 5 or so in the early 50s. Um, by the time I went to public health school, because I decided after playing doctor for so many years that I had to figure out why the United States was not so healthy compared to other countries. So when I went to public health school in 1992, we were 22nd, meaning 21 people in 21 countries had longer lives. Well, in the most recent data published by the United Nations Human Development Report in September, we now rank 44th. That is, there are among UN countries, which doesn't include Taiwan and Monaco and other small populations, there are 43 countries where people live longer lives. And I don't know about you, but I think most of us would rather live a longer life than a shorter one. So among these countries that have where people have longer lives are all the other rich countries, some like Chile or Czech Republic or Slovenia or China or even Thailand now has eclipsed us. People there appear to live longer lives. So this begs the question, why? And what I just described is what I coined the term health Olympics. Suppose health were an Olympic event and the race was how long you lived. Countries compete in Olympics. And so, uh, if health were an Olympic event measured by life expectancy, we wouldn't be there for the final day's race. We would have been disqualified in the trials.
In your book, I just want to jump in for a second because we have this recent example of the pandemic. And in your book, you discuss our terrible performance with the pandemic. I want to say what is so pressing about your book, I think, is that you raise the question of inequality, not just in delivery of healthcare, but inequality in the society. And one thing that's happened to the United States income inequality for the last 40 years, we've had a terrible downward spiral, and we have, dramatically more unequal society in terms of how people live. So that, to my mind, reading your book was sort of the main contribution. We've had some recent books showing this horrible inequality. We've also had discussion about why did we lead the world in deaths connected with the pandemic. Could you connect those two subjects to where we are?
Yes. So, as I tried to figure out why this was happening, I came up with two ideas that really explain it. The primary one is, as you say, our increasing inequality, and this is something we actually have chosen to have. That is, we decided to uh, aggrandize the billionaires and let them have as much as they can take, starting with the Reaganomics back in the 1980s. And it's continued apace so that now our inequality is scandalously extreme. So, how can inequality kill? I mean, that's the title of the book. So, and kills us all. That is, there's no one who can escape the mortality caused by inequality. Well, one thing inequality does is create a lot of stress in society, and we can see this in today's newspaper with the mass shootings down in Colorado Springs. Inequality is creating more stress amongst us, and we act out this stress in a variety of ways. Studies have linked mass shootings to county inequality and the presence of high incomes in those counties. And in Colorado Springs, there are some pretty wealthy people there. Uh, the longest life expectancies are in two nearby counties in Colorado, in the whole country. Not that far away are the lowest life expectancies in the country, namely Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in Oglala, Lakota County. So we have a huge difference in health outcomes within the country, and studies show this is true. This is related causally to inequality. And COVID comes into this because if you look at the states with the highest mortality or the counties with the highest mortality, depending on which particular period of the pandemic you look at, inequality kills people from COVID.
Could you explain how that works?
Okay, so when you have a highly unequal society, poorer people within that realm actually have poorer physiology. I tend to do this when I'm teaching a class by looking at lung function. If you take a deep breath and try and blow out as much air as you can in 1 second, poorer people are going to blow out less air in 1 second than richer people. So poorer people, through epigenetic mechanisms, are constituted differently biologically than richer people. And the people who've mostly succumbed in the pandemic have been poorer people by and large, and older people. You and I fall into that realm, but older, poorer people rather than richer, poorer people. That's the most important thing to consider. Poorer people have poorer health, and the reason is the inequality within the society that causes that.
In your book, I just want to clarify because I found it fascinating. You say it's not just a question of what money we spend, because we spend a lot on healthcare or the gadgets or the mechanics and so forth. You say it starts with birth. I mean,
Starts
it
before
starts with
birth.
your first years. So take us through that,
Okay.
because and connected it with the word you use in the book quite. often neoliberalism. I mean, we have an idea that has dominated us for the last 40 years. Reagan and Bill Clinton, these were the two pioneers, really, of the kind of deregulation that led to increased inequality. But, in your book, you mentioned we came out of World War II with a great belief in improving healthcare, improving everything. And we abandoned that. So, show us how it actually works.
So the first point, early life lasts a lifetime. So as we go from the erection to the resurrection, it's the first 1,000 days after conception when roughly half of our health as adults is programmed. Not, there are exceptions, but by and large, if you don't have a healthy early life, if you're conceived in poverty and grow up in poverty, you're not going to be so healthy later on. So, societies can privilege early life in a variety of ways. One way is to give a working woman who's pregnant paid time off after she has her baby. Only two countries in the world don't provide that ability. One is, of course, the United States. We can't afford it, it said. And the other country is Papua New Guinea, half of a big island north of Australia. Only two countries in the world with a population of 1 million or more who don't provide time off to parent after your paid time off after you have your baby. So that is really important. And why do we have policies? Well, why do we not have a paid parental leave act in this country? Well, it's being discussed in the current administration, but it's thought to be too costly. And this is for the richest, most powerful country in world history. Now, as you pointed out, we came out of World War II with a much more equal society. Uh, the people who gained the most income in the first decade or two after the war were the poorest fifth. In other words, the rising tide lifted the rowboats more than it lifted the yachts. The rich didn't like this, of course. The rich have always wanted only one thing throughout history, and that's everything. So they began scheming to lower the highest marginal tax rate, which was 96% in 1946, Reagan lowered it to below 30%. And now it's a bit above that, but not much above that. And that was through a variety of political policies that we embraced beginning in the 1970s called neoliberalism. And that basically means let's go back to the liberalism of the 1800s when markets sort of determined what happened and governments did not spend money for the people and we were touted as a meritocracy. You work hard and you get what you deserve. And so we've done this through decreasing taxes on the rich. And somehow we believe in the American dream, namely, before we die, we'll strike it rich. But the American dream is a nightmare. You've got to be asleep to experience the American dream. So we have come up with a situation with absolutely staggering economic inequality and worse health outcomes than, 50 or so other countries. And to achieve this, we spend 1/6 of our total economy on medical care, which is almost as much as the rest of the world combined.
Wait a minute, I got to stop you right there. Now, I know you got a master's in public health along with an MD, and your book is well documented. Is that really true, what you just said? I've never heard that before.
Okay, so if you go to World Health Organization or even to the uh, Our
Well, repeat the statement first of all, because
oh,
I just want to make sure I heard it
okay.
right.
So we spend on healthcare about $4 trillion. If you take the amount of money that other countries spend on healthcare, all the other countries in the world, it's a little over $4 trillion, all the other countries combined, but not much.
How come I've never heard this statistic? It's stunning. I've heard a statistic that we spend as much on the military as the rest of the countries combined. I've never heard this because if that's true, how could we have such miserable outcomes?
Well, that assumes that health and healthcare are synonymous. We do you want health or healthcare? Most people in this country use the phrase health to mean healthcare. We invest in health, access health, pay for health, insure health. So just by using that phraseology, we think it's healthcare that is produced that is produced. It's healthcare that produces health. So we should ask the question: do we want health or healthcare? Clearly, we don't have health. We, with a lot of uninsured people now numbering in tens of millions or more, a lot of people don't have access to health care. While it's being considered in now, Bernie Sanders and AOC are talking about Medicare for all, Ralph Nader, people like that. At least it's on the table, but it was never discussed. It was off the table for discussions about the Affordable Care Act. So you know, if you ask the question, how much do we spend? It's easy to come up with the figures on the internet. For 2019, it was $3.8 trillion. We don't have accurate figures for 2021, although most people estimate it's in the same $4 trillion ballpark. And adding up the rest of the country's expenditures, you can get that from our own, from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation website, funded by the Gates Foundation. You can get it even, our Central Intelligence Agency in its World Rankings website, this is our own country's CIA, produces a lot of this data. So if you think I'm spinning a lie, just go to the CIA World Rankings website. There's no
So,
question that what I'm presenting is out there in the public domain.
so let me just get the statement correctly. We, the United States, with hardly the largest population, spent as much, or roughly as much, as the rest of the world combined, and yet we've got what 50 nations that have better outcomes.
Yes, that's right.
So how do you square that?
Well, you assume it's healthcare that produces health. And the evidence for that is actually very limited. I think in the book, I cite a study that shows from Stanford University that looks at all the studies, considering rigorous studies, considering the impact of healthcare on health, and concludes that at most, healthcare is responsible for about 10% of mortality avoiding health outcomes.
So what are we doing wrong? And why does it connect with income inequality? Because that is the thesis of the book, and you make a compelling case. And I forget his name, Pickney or whatever, the French scholar who did the major, most important recent work on equality, uh, demonstrates that. Uh,
You're probably talking about
what's the
Thomas.
causal connection?
So you're probably talking about Thomas Piketty.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, right,
Capital in the 21st Century and Capital in
exactly.
Ideology, and his most recent book. A lot of people point out the adverse effects of inequality, but very few want to point out the tremendous number of studies that causally show that inequality produces worse health. First studies appeared in 1979. Now there are at least 400 studies making the link between inequality and worse health, income inequality, wealth inequality, uh, and worse health. And it takes a fair amount of courage to say this in public, even if you believe it, because it sounds preposterous. But as I say, I look at the morning newspaper today, and here's this mass shooting, and we have quite a few studies linking mass shootings in the United States to measures of income inequality at the county and state level.
Time for a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
While the FIFA World Cup is going on, listen to stories from your own backyard.
You know what the nickname for South Bay was? Soccer City, because we were way ahead of everybody.
It's an inside look from KCRW's Unfictional.
And I got a phone call. They asked me if I have guayos. The Colombians, they call guayos cleats. Pero necesitamos muchos guayos. We need a lot of shoes.
Football Confidential, stories of soccer in Los Angeles. Out now at kcrw.com/unfictional.
We're back with Scheer Intelligence and our guest. All right, so let's we're going to run out of time here, and it's probably the most important discussion we could be having, because there is an assumption that if you throw money at problems or spend money, and we haven't talked about the inequality of how that's spent, but nonetheless, there's an assumption of modernity. There's an assumption with high tech. We have a great medical system, and yet we have lousy outcomes. So give me the main thesis here, and how do you fix it?
So we need to rein in inequality. Let's propose.
Why? Other than that, it's I think morally defensible,
It's
but why?
killing us. I mean,
how is inequality killing us? Let's cut to the chase here.
By producing a highly stressed society. For example, if you try to measure stress among countries, we're in the top 5 of self-reported stress. So we're a highly stressed society, and that stress is killing us through a variety of mechanisms I began to describe earlier. The stress is most important when it is there in early life. In other words, if your mother and father were stressed as you were conceived and you lived in a stressful uterus, looking at the world outside, you programmed your physiology to survive, to reproduce. That's all we're here for. We're here to reproduce so the species doesn't die out. And then we pay the price later with all the chronic diseases that we suffer from. And another important thing to consider is that other countries have different ways of taking care of the stress in society. Japan, the longest lived country, everybody is stressed there. It's a stressful society, but they do things together. And one way to observe that is, do you ever see a lone Japanese tourist? No, they're always together. Do you ever see a lone American tourist? All the time. I mean, COVID sort of put the tourism into a bit of a quiet zone, but it's recurring now. And once again, Americans do things individually. We don't work together. The big income gap fosters that. I mean, this is a whole variety of ideas that I'm throwing at you, and to try and put them all together is difficult in this short period of time.
Well, that's a reason to buy the book, by the way. We're talking about a new book, and which spells all this out. I don't expect in a podcast, this is not a substitute for buying, let alone reading a book. The book is called Inequality Kills Us All, incredibly documented, thoughtful by a leading expert on healthcare, Dr. Stephen Bezruchka, and the subtitle is COVID-19's Health Lessons for the World. Okay, so what are COVID-19's health lessons? I want people to get the book, check it all out, but just in the time we have, give us the urgency of your message.
So we are, it is speculated that SARS-CoV-2 virus is going to continue to pester us. And I think we're at the end of the beginning of the pandemic. We have had the most deaths of any country in the world, and per population in the top 10 or 20. And what needs to be done to prepare for the next contagion in the what I call the pandemocene? That is, we're going to be seeing an era of a lot of these contagions that are going to kill us, and we have to change the political system that has created the catastrophe that COVID visited upon us in the last few years. That will require political choices that we, the people, make. We have chosen to have a few billionaires, and we can choose to not have them.
Well, what does that really mean? I mean, we spend a lot of money, but some people spend more money and have more money spent on them. What are your subtitle is COVID-19's health lessons for the world? What are they? If I'm prepping for the exam, okay, I'm going to take the final now. What are you looking for here? You're
So,
going to ask that question. What
so
are COVID-19's health lessons for the world?
very simply, economic inequality portends worse COVID-19 outcomes. We have studies of 84 countries. We have studies within the United States at the state and county level. The studies are very clear, and so the lesson is we have to decrease inequality. We also have to do something about poverty in this country. Inequality and poverty are close cousins, and we have more poverty within the United States than any other rich country. And this is killing us.
How? How does this inequality kill us?
I go back to the same idea. It causes more stress.
Ah,
Basically, for example, there's a study done uh, on air rage, namely, if you go to in a passenger airplane that has a first class cabin and there's more air rage, various kinds of behaviors in the plane, than if there is no first class cabin. If you enter through the first class cabin rather than behind it, as on many jumbo jets, there's less air rage in first class. So when the people in first class see us walking by, they really get wigged out. If they don't see us walking by, there's a little less air rage, but it's especially present in coach class. What is that telling us? It's telling us that class differences are making a huge impact on our society. That's air rage. And there's been more air rage now with the pandemic just because inequality has soared. Similarly, there's more road rage. You can read about that in the papers as well. People are, and people driving more expensive, two garage cars, they're the ones perpetrating the road rage. What are they doing? They're expressing the stress in their lives.
well, we saw that in the election. I mean, people seizing the House of,
Yes.
the People's House of Congress,
Right.
and supporting a president, soon not to be a president, then who, what catered to that rage, or as demagogues often do of any party. Is that also a health problem?
Of course. And who were the people in the, storming the Capitol? They were from Republican jurisdictions who were relatively poor. And so we've actually seen that coming from a Republican state or county, your health is going to be worse than coming from a more Democratic county. You see this at the political jurisdiction level, and that's because there are these factors called deaths of despair. White middle-aged adults are dying in greater numbers from alcohol, drug, and suicide causes of death because they're not achieving the American dream and they're blaming themselves. That's the weird thing in this country. You blame yourself for what is basically a political problem. It's not your personal failing.
Well, we're both of an advanced age, and in your book, you talk about how our consciousness about class has evolved. And I would say in the post World War II period, there was an illusion, it had long been a powerful idea in the American experience, that we were going to become a classless society in terms of at least opportunity. It didn't happen. It went the other way, actually. We haven't solved our systemic racial problems, so that's an important source of class distinction. But now we, as you point out in the book, have all of these mechanisms for increasing class distinction. And so I want to tap into your wisdom as uh, a practicing physician who's practiced in other countries as well, but also given your masters in public health. The idea your book really introduces is that the main reason America has become less healthy, considerably so, is because we have failed really the early promise of that post war period of the New Deal, of a kind of idealism that we grew up, people like us, grew up accepting as the norm.
Yes, I mean, what can I say? You brought up racism, and we're a very highly racialized society, and African Americans have much worse outcomes, not as bad as the American Indians or indigenous populations. And the other thing is that I mentioned several times: poorer people have poorer health, and that's a class distinction. And the two are tied together, as Isabel Wilkerson's book on class, The Origins of Our Discontents, points out. We, we're supposed to be a middle class society, but the middle class has been hollowed out. We have half of the country is really can be classed as being poor, and we have a much smaller middle class, and then we have not the richest 1%. It's really a hundredth of that basically have all the power in society. They make the decisions. They control the corporations. We think we have democracy in terms of electing our political leaders, but given the corporate power, we don't have democracy in the workplace. So that's another thing that needs to be worked on. But, you get what you measure. And as long as we measure wealth creation, remember the Dow Jones Index, that's about wealth creation, or the NASDAQ, we need to measure our health compared to other countries. And rather than seeing our health decline now, absolutely, we need to reverse that and get it improving compared to other countries. And what's that going to take? Well, it's becoming aware of how healthy we are in comparison to other countries. So we should report the Doug Jones Index. How's Doug and his family doing, rather than the Dow Jones Index? And I would offer Doug Jones and his family they're not doing so well.
So well, let's summarize. I mean, you've looked at the world figures as well as U.S. So which countries are doing better, and how did they escape this or minimize the impact of this insecurity? I mean, what is it that they were social democratic countries like Germany, France, even England to some degree, or once a considerable degree? What is the difference?
So let's take the longest lived country in the world, Japan. We have a lot of lessons to learn from Japan because in the Second World War,
Can I just interrupt you? I found that fascinating in your book. You point out that we encourage the Japanese in the occupation to do sensible things that we haven't done ourselves.
Exactly. We put in place the policies that Japan needed to have to become the healthiest country in the world. So what were those? We had destroyed Japan at the end of the Second World War, dropped 2 atomic bombs on them, firebombed Tokyo, and their life expectancy was estimated to be around 24, 25 years at the end of the war. We then occupied the country and sent the world's greatest population health doctor there, General Douglas MacArthur, to occupy the country and revive it, resurrect it, so to speak. And so he came up with 3 policies that he actually wrote into the Constitution. The United States is responsible for producing Japan's post-World War Constitution. One of the articles was Article 9, which said Japan shall never maintain a military, an army. They shall resolve disputes peacefully. That's written into their constitution. They put a public health clause into the Constitution, namely, the government is responsible for the health of the people. That's Article 23. And they also broke up the large concentrations of power. There were 13 big family-owned corporations, zaibatsu, and MacArthur said you can't have such concentrations of wealth and power and have a democracy. That was another part of the Constitution, namely universal suffrage. They're going to have a democracy. But he broke up the concentrations of power, the 13 zaibatsu. Also, Japan was a rice farming economy, and some 37,000 landowners had 50 million peasants working the rice farms. And again, MacArthur said you can't have such concentrations of power. He bought the land from the landlords, sold it to the rice farming tenants, and gave them a 30-year low interest loan to pay for the land. And the Japanese abhor loans, so most of them had paid off the loans in a year, and 94% of all the land in Japan changed hands. Historians call it the most successful land reform program in history. So by democratization, decentralization, that is redistributing, and demilitarization, those 3 principles produced the most rapid improvements in health ever seen on the planet. And by 1978, Japan was the longest lived country. And
they are today.
And have and remain so today. And Japan is a lesson for us to understand that the political nature matters far more than personal behaviors. Out of all the countries, out of all the rich countries, Japan has 3 times as many men smoking cigarettes as in the United States. If I told you that's the reason Japan's so healthy, namely everyone smokes there. And by the way, if you've been to Japan, you can easily observe their smoking behaviors everywhere. So Japan is an example of a country that achieved the best health status in the world by means of policies that we enforced upon it, and personal behaviors don't matter so much in producing this. And similarly, healthcare doesn't matter that much.
But I could stop you there, and people will be shocked by the smoking example. But I want to. We have to wrap this up, and I didn't give you a proper introduction, uh, but you're this rare figure out of a very successful high, the best colleges and all, and you haven't sold your soul to, people trying to charge us more money for medical or just collecting more greater wealth. So just late in the discussion, but I'm trying to get people to read your book because I thought it was fascinating. And who are you? You went to Harvard, and then take us through mountain climbing briefly, everything else you've done, but how come you didn't use your privilege to just make our health system worse?
Well, I grew up in Toronto, Canada. My father repaired shoes. We lived above the shoe repair store. And I grew up in a working class neighborhood. And I never appreciated inequality because most of us were all pretty similar in this neighborhood. And then when I studied mathematics, and then I went at the University of Toronto, and then I went to Harvard to graduate school in mathematics, and suddenly I was among all these privileged people, and I came to understand that there was something wrong about that. I had been climbing mountains, and so I decided to go to Nepal and get close to the highest mountains in the world. And I lived amongst people who had essentially nothing. And they didn't realize how little they didn't have because we didn't have the fancy communications channels that we have today. I then had the privilege of going back to the United States to go to medical school. And I chose Stanford. Again, how does a shoe repairman's son up his status? Well, since I did well in school, I went to prestigious schools. So Harvard, Stanford, then Johns Hopkins. Uh, but I realized that that kind of status was not something that I really wanted to achieve. I would rather be known for what I did and taught and talked about than the prestigious schools I went to. So, although it's a way to improve your status, uh, I'm hoping that the ideas that I talk about and express are far more important than that.
Well, that's why we've taken this time to get at the book, and we haven't done it justice. The book is a really important contribution to the discussion about healthcare and the quality of life. It's called Inequality Kills Us All. It's just out now. The subtitle is COVID-19's Health Lessons for the World. Dr. Stephen Bezruchka, I always get that wrong, but let me say it's really, if you want to read one book about what's wrong with our healthcare system and what we can do about it, that's it. And that statistic that we talked about before, I'm still going to, as soon as I get off, I'm going to check that out. But if it is true that we spend more on, let me get it right, we spend more on, or as much on healthcare as approximately the rest of the world, and we have this poor outcome. Have I stated it correctly in
Yeah,
conclusion?
yes. I mean, not as much as the rest of the world combined. It's just, close to. We're talking about 44% of the world's healthcare bill back in 2019 was spent.
And where do we rank? Where do we? You said we're
Well, the
50th.
best figures are those of the United Nations, and there we rank 44th, behind Barbados, Croatia, Thailand, Qatar, and all the other rich countries.
Well, since you were at one point active in the Nobel Prize winning Physicians for Social Responsibility, there is a parallel. We also spent, roughly, somewhere 40% or whatever to 50% of our military, and yet we've had one of these windless wars and endless wars and nonsensical wars after another. So there is a parallel. Anyway, I want to thank you for doing this. Urge people to get Inequality Kills Us All. I want to thank the folks at our NPR station, KCRW, in Santa Monica, and for posting this show. Laura Konderjarian and Christopher Ho. I want to thank Joshua Scheer, our executive producer, and the JKW Foundation in memory of Gene Stein, a terrific writer and journalist, for helping fund these shows. See you next week with another edition of Scheer Intelligence.
Tout ça m'est bien